A recent 2024 global study put U.S. employee engagement at just 31%. And that mirrors what's happening globally as well, in Europe and in other places as well. So let's zoom out from that for a moment. That means less than a third of our employees feel they can bring the best version of themselves to work. That's the lowest percentage we've seen in at least the last decade.
Welcome to Revenue Insights. We're joined by revenue leaders from some of the highest growth companies. Together, we explore how they built their revenue teams, the journeys they've been on, and the lessons they've learned along the way. Revenue Insights is brought to you by Ebsta. We're an AI-first revenue intelligence platform designed to help you close more deals, retain more customers, and forecast better. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment of the Ebsta Revenue Insights podcast. I am delighted to have with me today Greg Laos from a company called Weave. I'll allow Greg to introduce himself in a second, but for the purposes of everybody listening, the conversation today is something that's very close to my heart and certainly something that Greg is very, very passionate about. And we're going to be talking about the impact of trust, but not between businesses and their customers, but between the employers and employees. It's something that we've almost had a brief meeting of the minds over. And I'm really excited to have this conversation today. So for the purpose of everybody else in the audience, Greg, why don't you give us a little introduction to yourself and Weave, and we can take it from there.
Well, thanks, Adam. I am looking forward to this. This is going to be a fun conversation to dive into, what I think is not just a leadership problem or a revenue issue. I think it's a business risk that's hiding in plain sight that we need to address. But to give your listeners a little bit of an introduction, Weave is a publicly traded software as a service company based in Lehi, Utah, in the United States, and we serve the healthcare space. At its core, Weave is an all-in-one customer communication and payments platform. What we try to do is solve the problem of fragmented communications and inefficient operations that seem to plague the healthcare space. And we do that by sort of connecting every patient touch point together. So think about it essentially as anything that helps a healthcare practitioner to run their business and provide better quality care to their patients. That's what we do. That's sort of what our ethos is. What I do at Weave specifically, I'm very privileged to lead the payments division inside of Weave. And what my division does, is we help healthcare practitioners receive payments. As simple as that. If they don't get paid, they don't have a viable business, obviously. So what we do is we allow them and help them and enable them to take payments both in office and then after the patient leaves their office. So think of things, Adam, is like traditional credit card and debit card acceptance in the doctor's office, text to pay, online bill pay, and other fintech offerings like consumer lending, buy now, pay later. That's everything we provide to our customers. And we're proud to say that we process over $2 billion in payments for our customers. So really, really pleased with that. I've been in the revenue and sales game for, well over 2 decades, leading global teams in both the fintech and also the cybersecurity industries. Prior to Weave, I was most recently Chief Revenue Officer for Viking Cloud, a cybersecurity firm that globally was based in Dublin, Ireland, and in the U.S. Was based here in Chicago, where I reside. And I've been a part of 2 company exits, totaling over $2 billion in book value, and I was even a part of an IPO earlier in my career. So my career's been a really fun ride.
Amazing. Yeah, really, really amazing story. And there's so much in there that you just shared that we could probably unpack today. You've been through the era of growth at all costs. You've had multiple exits. We're now in the era of profitable, efficient growth. We have the advent of artificial intelligence, but we decided to pick a topic around the trust between employers and employees. So maybe perhaps you could set the scene. What is it about employer trust that is somewhat of a passion for you, Greg?
Well, I am very passionate about the fact that I think we're seeing a fundamental breakdown, Adam, of the employer-employee relationship. What used to be a partnership based on growth and loyalty and the shared vision of growing a company together has deteriorated into something that, when I talk to fellow leaders, they agree is transactional now, in many ways. And I would argue that at times it's even adversarial and combative. All of the studies tell us employee engagement is at the lowest it's been in a decade or more. And at the same time, worker trust in corporate leadership is declining faster than any of us could have ever imagined happening. I think it's a massive problem because when we lose trust, we lose talent. And when we lose talent, we lose revenue growth. At the end of the day, this is a people business. People drive the revenue. And, I'm really looking forward to talking about why this matters, and what both frontline employees, but also leaders can do to sort of rebuild that trust. But I'm happy. I know I'm pontificate a bit on this because I'm so passionate about it. I'm happy, data drives everything that we do in business, right? I'm happy to give you and your listeners some data and analysis and studies and outcomes that show us this truly is. It's not just Greg with his philosophy. It's a real problem that we need to address. So I'm happy to share some of that with
you. Yeah, I'd love to hear more. I think from my context, Greg, our listeners will be very familiar with the Ebster benchmark report. It's an annual report that we've done every year, and picking one stat in specifically, and we'll relate this to sales and revenue, right? That in 2024, 14% of sellers delivered 80% of the revenue. And therefore, if trust is eroded and you lose your A players, you only need one or two star sellers to leave or not be happy. And you potentially lost a very, very significant portion of your revenue. And everything's become almost really hyper focused on around these A players and these A sellers. That I see, and we see that trust is almost more important because you need to maintain those superstars, that talent that you talked about. So perhaps, yeah, like I'd love to hear some more from your side of things, from a data standpoint. What's driving your thinking and what's driving the focus on it?
Yeah, you got it. And I think that was so well said. The margin for error today is so slim in so many different areas, but particularly in the people business, right? To your point, we have a smaller percentage of our producers driving outsized results. And that's why I want to talk later in the podcast around how do we attract talent? How do we retain talent? But trust is really going to be the key component of how to keep people producing and make sure that they don't go to your competition. So couldn't agree more. Yeah, let me run the listeners through some data points. So it isn't just Greg getting on his soapbox, but this is real stuff that is having a big impact in terms of what we're doing every single day. A recent 2024 global study put U.S. employee engagement at just 31%. And that mirrors what's happening globally as well, in Europe and in other places as well. So let's zoom out from that for a moment. That means less than a third of our employees feel they can bring the best version of themselves to work. That's the lowest percentage we've seen in at least the last decade. That's a real problem. And here's one that really got my attention and really blew my mind, and I suspect it'll blow your listeners' minds as well. There's a wonderful study called the Edelman Trust Barometer that is put out by the communications firm Edelman. And they measure trust in major institutions, okay? Their 2024 report showed a 21% increase in worker distrust toward corporate leaders, a 21% increase. Here's what's particularly interesting. that increase outpaced the rise in distrust toward government and the media. So let's zoom out, fellow leaders. Our employees are distrusting us at a higher rate than Congress. That is a real problem. What are we doing, right?
What is the cause of that, Greg? What's your take on it?
I think it's fundamentally comes down to the lack of leadership in the workplace today with respect to trust and lack of understanding of what our employees really want. And I'd love to offer some suggestions later in the podcast in terms of what we can do better. But I think, part of what we're seeing here are layoffs to juice earnings. That's a problem. That erodes trust. I think there's a number of things I think that we as leaders can do to make that better. But before we move off this, I also want to mention one other thing. The Gallup organization tells us that organizations that have highly engaged employees consistently outperform their peer group in earnings per share. So there's a real ROI to this whole trust thing.
My personal experience of it is huge. I've spent my life working in SaaS businesses, typically smaller SaaS businesses, right? And we see tremendous growth when you get a small nucleus of people that are bought into a vision and are working towards a common goal. And as those businesses scale and they get more and more diverse and events and exits and they tend to be owned by more numbers focused, potentially private equity, potentially VC, I've seen it kill culture overnight. And it's actually been hugely detrimental to the business. I've been part of that journey myself. So completely on board with what you're saying, but how do you think about that as a leader, in managing your team at Weave? And what are some of the things that you do to build trust with your employees?
Yeah. And I think, to answer your previous question, I think the answer really is stronger trust-driven leadership, right? I mean, there's no question. I think that's what it is. I'm happy to share some of the things that I think we as leaders can do to strengthen that trust-driven relationship between ourselves and our teams. I employ a lot of those things to answer your question at Weave, or at least I try to. I am certainly not a perfect leader, but I am mindful of many of the things that I'm talking about with you. So I'm happy to give you a handful of suggestions that I have for leaders and those that I try to employ myself. I think, and I mentioned it a moment ago, the number one thing that I would implore all leaders and organizations to stop doing is stop using layoffs to juice earnings. We are seeing a rise of that. And I understand the market rewards that. You operate in a leaner way, you're able to throw off more profits. But the employees who survive those sorts of cuts see it and remember it. And your reputation will matter in the workplace or in the marketplace tremendously as you try to attract talent. So I think it's very important that, look, layoffs have to happen from time to time. You retrench as an organization, but you need to really be cautious about the overuse of large-scale employee separations. Here's another one that I suggest that leaders employ, and I try to do that at Weave, and I think Weave does a good job with this. Build a real culture, not a gimmick. Not a gimmick or a slogan. Free lunch and foosball tables in the break room don't solve the problem of toxic leadership in a toxic environment, right? Employees appreciate perks, but ultimately, Adam, what they want is respect. And what I try to do every day at Weave with my team is show up in a very authentic way and try to deliver them the level of respect that they deserve. And quite frankly, they demand these days. I hope that I do that well. It's never a perfect process, but I try to get better at it. Certainly every day. Understand what your employees want. I don't know if you notice, I like to talk, Adam. I'm the perfect podcast host. You just ask a question and I'll go for 5 minutes, right? And I think a lot of leaders like me are the same way. We're dynamic. We love to talk. We want to inspire. But you know what we sometimes don't do really well? We need to talk. Then we need to be quiet. We need to ask a question, talk, that we need to be quiet and we need to actually listen. And we need to listen and understand what employees really want. And what employees wanted 10 or 15 years ago is different than what they want now. The Gen Z and millennial generation are standing up in organizations and demanding something that's a bit different. They want flexibility in the workplace. They want a voice. They want to make sure that they have a clear career path forward. And they want to make sure that they're doing meaningful work and that they ultimately, bottom line, can trust their leader to create an environment with them that will allow them to be set up to win. One thing I don't mention is compensation, because a lot of leaders, well, I pay my employees really well, or even pay them. That's important because we're all capitalists. We want to make money, but compensation by itself is not enough to make up for distrust or to make up for other things that employees want.
I completely align to all of those. I think, certainly from my perspective, showing up with empathy, showing up with the ability to listen and try and put yourself in the shoes of the other person is a skill that not everybody has, but is an important one to at least learn, or if not master. But at the same time, you need to create a culture of transparency. And as a leader, I feel like we need to own our mistakes publicly and let people know that it's okay to make mistakes, provided that we learn from them and we actively try and avoid those together and collectively, driving that kind of common goal forward. I've seen too many times kind of, people being, not praised for the good things and then been torn apart for the bad things, and publicly as well. And I think that's not okay, particularly for the younger generation, right? Like we need to praise the good things often, regularly, and we need to course correct in private. I think everybody has to kind of take some ownership for their own mistakes and their own journey and show that it's okay to fail, because we're in a sport that means that we're going to fail regularly. We're going to fail more than we win, right? If your win rate's anything like mine, we're winning 1 in 4, 1 in 5 deals. And so failure is inevitable, and we need to kind of celebrate that and learn from it and have that open, honest dialogue and really trying to kind of encourage my teams to come to me and tell me what they think went wrong and how they're going to solve. And I think that also leads in then to accountability and ownership of their own book of business, which I found to be really kind of powerful in that. But I'd love to hear your take.
I think you're spot on, and I think one of the items I would love to talk about before we conclude is to talk about what this topic isn't, right? It isn't HR fluff. And I think you're spot on in the sense that, what we are not suggesting here that we should inject the workplace with toxic optimism, where everything's bright and cheery, right? Where everyone's doing everything right all of the time. And that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is looking for opportunities to applaud and elevate employees when they do a great job, to not always leverage and lean into and be over-indexing on everything that's broken. Because to your point, there'll be a lot of things you can point to that are broken, didn't go well, areas for improvement. Leaders earn the right to be able to offer constructive critiques of their teams when they've shown up in a way that is an ally for their teams versus an adversary. And they've highlighted things that have gone well, right? And I think it's very important. And I think it ties into one of the other suggestions that I give leaders on how we can rebuild this bridge of trust. And what I try to do at Weave in a senior leader role is to practice what you preach. And you alluded to it, right? If you want your employees to have this heightened sense of accountability for what they do and to be elite, right, at trying to get better, then you need to stand up and be front of that line, right? I sometimes talk to leaders and they say, I want my employees back in the office 5 days a week. that's probably another podcast episode. I'd love to talk about that because I always say, well, why? But why do I bring that up? Because what I often see is this desire to bring in employees back in the office 5 days a week, which can have some merit. I'm not necessarily criticizing that. But what I see are leaders that are still working from home 3 days a week, right? If you demand learning and feedback from your employees, then you have to welcome dissent and different viewpoints, right? You have to live your culture and not just talk about it. And that's what I try to do at Weave. I try to be mindful of the fact that the culture that we're building on my team can't just be a catchy slogan on a poster. It has to be a lived experience for everyone involved, for sure.
We all know time kills deals, but do you know the impact of slippage on your win rates? In the latest EBSTA benchmarks report, we see 36% of opportunities slipped by more than a month past their anticipated close date. These inconsistencies make it almost impossible for leaders to forecast accurately. EBSTA is the only provider that blends data, insights, technology, and service to guarantee leaders an accurate forecast within 6 months. If forecast accuracy is important to you, book a demo and find out how EBSTA can help. Go to ebsta.com/demo.
Absolutely love that. I guess one thing that's on my mind, Greg, we live in an environment where we want to, we're both firm believers in kind of building that trust. We also live in an environment where there is an inevitable pressure to grow the business. And we talked about that. And we talked about, kind of high growth environment. There is a relentless pressure to hit a number every month, every quarter, every fiscal year. How do you think about balancing that desire for growth and being, super focused on performance and a number, while at the same time trying to kind of incorporate an element of, that employee trust, being safe to make a mistake, all of that kind of stuff. How do you think about balancing those two things?
Yeah, you're tying right into sometimes the pushback I get into this philosophy. But I think the short answer to your question is this. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive. You cannot have revenue without respect, at least for very long. So we have to focus on both things at the same time. The pushback that I get sometimes, Adam, is, oh, Greg, this sounds good, but I've got a number to hit. I don't have time for this. I can't coddle people. Or not often, but sometimes I'll get, oh, this is just HR fluff, right? So let me be clear on a couple of things of why I'm so passionate. First and foremost, I am a capitalist. I am an unabashed revenue leader, capitalist. I am not shy about saying that I entered business because I wanted to make money. And I want my teams to make money. And I want my shareholders to make money. This isn't about trying to inject socialism into a capitalist environment. Business is a full contact sport. You talked about that. Now more than ever, revenue leaders are in constant pressure to deliver outsized outsized outcomes at a rapid scale, right? But what we're talking about isn't about warm hugs and cupcakes in the break room. It's about respect and revenue. I think there is real ROI to building trust. If we don't focus on it, we will leave money and people on the table. So in short, if you're feeling the pressure, my fellow revenue leaders, if you're feeling the pressure to hit a number, it's even more incumbent that you lean into strengthening your relationship with your employees, because you don't have the time not to.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think about not just, okay, well, I've lost a head count, therefore I've got I've got a hole in my quota that I need to fill. I've also got an incredible amount of invested time, effort, and energy and product knowledge that's been implemented and then is potentially walking out of the business. And in smaller kind of, high growth scale ups, like, Ebsta's currently with sub 10 million ARR. That's a really important thing to do. We've invested time, effort, and energy building, upskilling, training someone for them to walk out of the business because there isn't a level of understanding or a level of, trust that we understand the things that are wrong with the engine right? We work in sales, we live or die by the number that we deliver, but salespeople tend to get put on the end of they're the ones that are next or on the line when it comes to those casualties, all based on the number that they've hit. And actually, it's often not, they're not entirely in control of hitting that number, because they're not necessarily in control of the accounts they get. They're not necessarily in control of the territory they get. They're not necessarily in control of the investment into marketing and the content strategy and the identification of the right products at the right time. There's a whole host of things that the rep isn't in control of, but ultimately they are the ones that tend to be expended based on a set of things that they can't control. So how do you balance those things in when you're making decisions about headcount and when you do have to make layoffs?
Well, I think to my point about business is a full contact sport, right? It is not for the faint of heart. And leaders are often put in positions where you have to make very hard choices. If you're retrenching, if you're pivoting to a new solution or the marketplace fit for a new product isn't what you expected, then unfortunately you will have to exit people from the organization. Also, even if none of that happens, Adam, we always have to be on the lookout for folks that are not producing, right? Or they've been given every opportunity to do so. They've been given the coaching, the trust. And for whatever reason, whether it's not a good fit or they just don't have the will or the way to do so, we have to make those hard decisions, right? But you can make those decisions with a level of respect that says to the folks that remain, this is still a good place to work. The other suggestion I have for leaders that could rebuild that trust that I try to bring to Weave, and I think sometimes we lose sight. We focus a lot on retaining our best employees, right? But what we sometimes forget is we need to attract great employees too, right? And so what I encourage my leaders to do is today commit to better hiring practices. I talk to job seekers every week, and the experiences they're going through are embarrassing. So ghosting candidates is now the norm, right? Excessively long interview cycles, frustrating candidates. What I try to do with my team is we've really streamlined the interview process. We've brought great clarity in terms of the type of individual that we want, and also great clarity of communication to help candidates to understand what's expected of them if they do win the role, right? I always say this to my peers: employee engagement starts with the first interview. We often think that employee engagement starts day one when they go through onboarding. It doesn't. It's the experience they have during the interview process. And if it's a poor one, or it's one that lacks urgency or clarity of communication, then what you're going to have is an employee that's going to onboard into your organization that is going to maybe lean out a little bit more when in fact you need them to lean in and put their foot on the gas pedal moment one, right? Because we're under pressure to hit numbers. But I will say just one other comment. I think there's shared accountability here. We've talked a lot about what leaders can do differently. I think employees need to show up better too, Adam. I mean, I think that there's work to be done on both sides of this equation for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, here's a maybe a slightly different question. If you're an employee rather than an employer, in your mind, what makes a great employee enhance the trust that they can bring to the table? What are the things that they can do that bring trust to the table immediately in your eyes?
Yeah, I think employees need to show up better, right? I think they do. And that sometimes is not a popular, that's not often a popular opinion. Yeah, I think one, understand that you work in a capitalistic environment and you are not owed success. Okay? You cannot reap the benefits of a capitalist system and expect socialist behaviors and outcomes. It doesn't work that way. So employees need to recognize the benefits of capitalism and understand that they have to go out and earn every part of their success. While they should demand and expect respect from their leaders and better leadership behaviors, they also need to make sure that they understand that respect goes both ways, right? So show up with more respect to your leaders. Come to work with a little less cynicism, right? Effort and results still matter. And it's almost like work ethic is on the out. I don't know if you've noticed that. Right? The grind and you're going to burn yourself out. I hear this sometimes from employees. Work ethic does not have to mean burnout. If you have a leader that is expecting you to be available 24/7, the answer is not to stop working hard. What's the answer? Find a new leader. Find a new organization. That might be what the answer is. I don't know. But I think one of the primary things that employees can do to show up better is to own their 20 square feet. What does that mean? There's this wonderful performance organization called Focus 3 that was led by a wonderful gentleman named Tim Kipe, who unfortunately passed away recently. And he talked about employees needing to own their 20 square feet. What does that mean? It means don't wait for permission to lead. You may not lead people. You may have just entered the workforce, for example, but you are leaders. You can lead yourself by your behaviors. You can lead others. And here's another thing that I think employees who demonstrate leadership can do. And I hope that those listeners to this podcast who fall into this category will do this immediately after listening to this podcast. If you have a good boss, if you have a boss that emulates a lot of the behaviors that you and I are suggesting should be demonstrated in the workplace, they show up well, they listen, they have your back, they hold you accountable, and they give you stretch goals, but they make sure at the same and push you to succeed, but at the same time set you up to succeed as well. Reach out to them, pick up the phone, send them an email, send them a Slack, whatever your preferred form of communication is, and say, boss, I just want to recognize I could have a lot of other bosses, and I really appreciate what you've done for me. Thank you. You may think that's cliche and trite and quaint, but leaders need to be fed too. And to your point earlier, the amount of pressure on revenue leaders today is like nothing it's ever been. So feed your leaders, folks. It's insane. So feed your leaders, help them and help to guide them, to let them know that there is ROI in treating you with respect and pushing you to excellence. Sometimes employees think that leaders they've arrived and they don't need to be motivated or inspired. I can assure you, if you are a CRO, frequently the board is not an inspiration in your life because they want more and more and more, right? So if you're on a leader's team and you are delighted by how they show up for you, let them know that. I think it's incredibly important and underestimated.
Appreciation is really important. It is really important. As a leader myself, it does give me fuel when I hear that someone appreciates the way that I handle a situation or the way that I approach, work. It really does. And one of the things that we spoke about before we kind of dived into the full recording was Simon Sinek. I'm sure everybody is aware of Simon Sinek. I don't need to go into any more than that. But he did this lecture or TED talk, and he talked about the Navy SEALs and how that they would much rather have an employee or a part of their unit that was maybe not a super stellar performer, but was of high trust, rather than a toxic leader that was, absolutely killing it from a performance standpoint, because that they deployed trust. And he talks about how businesses have, lots of metrics and lots of measurements to tell you how everyone's performing. But we don't really have a metric, or it's not a measure that sits in the boardroom. It's not a measurement that, our investors and our private equity houses and our VCs backers are looking at across the employee breadth. But how do you think about measuring trust, or how do you validate the people in your organization at Weave, and whether they're, high trust or not?
Well, I'll tell you one way I don't do it is, although these can be useful from time to time, but, employee surveys. I I hear from a lot of leaders, well, we do employee surveys once a year and we get these results and we're high in trust. Let me make it abundantly clear. Most of your employees are not being honest on those employee surveys. They want to keep their jobs. Very few of them are going to be bold. How do I measure trust? It's tricky. The people part of business is the hardest thing that we do. It's not product development. It's not pipeline growth. It's leading people. And to answer your question specifically, it is about that one-to-one engagement, right? It's about asking questions, and it doesn't happen overnight. Employees have to feel comfortable and be in a safe space to really be transparent with you. But once that happens, once there's safety, once they feel it, just sit back. They'll tell you everything you want to know. If you genuinely sit there and go to your employees and say, give me one thing I'm doing well, give me two things that I can improve upon, you will begin to see the transformation. So how do you measure it? You measure it by the responses that you receive. You also measure it by how effective are your employees in doing their job when no one is looking. Because that's when you know the trust is high. Do you have employees that are leading themselves? The most elite teams, right, are peer led. It's not on you. It's on the peer group to be able to lead. So you talk about Simon Sinek. He talks about that, right? It's about the team trusting one another and elevating that performance, right? And it's not a leader being very hierarchical and dominating and dictatorial and pushing down. It's about developing that team in a cohesive way so that rising tide lifts all boats, right? And that's really where I think our outcome needs to be, is how do we create that sort of environment?
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Are there any last tales of wisdom? Is there anything that we haven't covered today that would be dynamite for the audience?
Yeah, I think it's, a summary and a reminder. I think this is not HR fluff. This is not a nice to have when you get to it. People leadership, right? Engaging our teams and rebuilding the bridge of trust is essential. Yes, you can, dominate your team and push them over the edge and you'll get some short-term results. But when the music stops, as leaders, we want to make sure that there's a chair available for us. And the only way we're going to do that is by developing teams and making sure they're performing. The central theme of what we've talked about is trust, right? Trust is a two-way street like we've talked about, but trust starts at the top with us as leaders. We have the power to affect change. So it's got to start with us. Our employees emulate and mirror what they see in us. If we want them to be less entitled, we need to stop acting so entitled, like we've arrived because we've achieved a certain title or position. And ultimately, the Gen Z and millennial generations are really looking for authenticity. You need to be real in the workplace. And I think ultimately repairing the bridge, it begins with leaders like us who have the courage, the humility, and the skill to frankly lead differently in today's work environment. Not softer, not weaker, right? But with strength and more humanity. And I think it's not only the right thing to do, Adam. I think it's what drives results. There's a ton of ROI that we can squeeze out of trust. And my hope is that we can start to change things a bit and move more toward that direction. I think our P&Ls will be stronger as a result.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And look, we're the ones that are accountable for doing it, right? It's certainly not coming from the top down. It's certainly not, investor. We live in, as you said right at the very beginning, we live in a capitalist society. And this measure is got to come from us and the leaders of the businesses that we run. So 100% agree. Look, Greg, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad. This is probably one of the favorite podcasts that I've ever done with Ebster over the last 2 years of my tenure. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors at Weave. Feel free to hook up with Greg on LinkedIn, myself, Adam, on LinkedIn as well. But yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up there. Say thank you very much, and wish everyone a farewell.
Thank you, Adam. Really enjoyed it. It was a great conversation today.
Thanks for listening to Revenue Insights from Ebsta. If you want to learn more from some of the brightest minds on how to predictably and efficiently grow revenue, then subscribe to our newsletter. We'll deliver actionable insights straight to your inbox. Go to ebsta.com/newsletter. See you soon.